It's really great to be here. Before I get started about the project, I want to say a few words about the different researchers on the team. So I'm with the Forest Service Philadelphia Field Station. And as some of you may know, the Forest Service research has a network of urban field stations, and we work closely with local partners to co-produce actionable knowledge. My colleague Hamil Pearsall, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, she's a faculty member at Temple University. She studies the social dimensions of sustainability, including the green gentrification phenomenon. Liz Pearsall is a grad student in that same department at Temple. She studies labor and urban greening, among other things. She carried out much of the research I'll be presenting today. Amber Grant is a grad student at Ryerson University in Toronto who has been studying environmental justice and urban forest plans and programs in the US. And Liz and Amber are both here today and will be joining for the Q&A. And I also want to express deep appreciation for our partners, the tree team at the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society, or PHS, with whom we developed and carried out this work, and colleagues at Philadelphia Parks and Recreation, or PPR, who you heard from earlier this afternoon. And we're building on the findings from the outreach phase of the Philly Tree Plan. So I imagine that all of us here are quite aware of the inequities in urban tree canopy cover that exist in many cities. Neighborhoods in the US tend to have more tree cover when they are more white, have more high income residents, more highly educated residents and homeowners. Tree cover is also related to urban form, with more tree cover in areas with lower density housing. There's also legacy effects of past discriminatory housing policies, such as redlining and urban renewal. And tree planting programs sometimes adjust their practices in response to these inequities. For example, in Philly, both PHS and PPR have been working hard to deepen engagement in low canopy neighborhoods. Both organizations have established priority neighborhoods. The Yard Tree Giveaway program from PPR has been using mini grants to neighborhood organizations to compensate for their time organizing and recruiting residents. And PHS has developed their stewardship training materials in Spanish in partnership with community leaders in Latino neighborhoods. And yet, in many tree planting and giveaway programs, inequities persist. In a study in Baltimore and Washington, DC, free street trees were more commonly planted in wealthy, highly educated white areas. In this graph along the bottom, there are categories for market segment groups that combine lifestyle and human demographic information. If tree planting were truly equitable, then those little orange triangles would all be around 1 for the odds ratio. The fact that the market segments called upscale avenues and high society are much higher than 1 indicates that they are receiving more trees relative to the size of their neighborhoods. But notably, there seems to be some success in the Philly programmatic strategies that I mentioned earlier. This is the same sort of graph I just showed you, illustrating what kinds of neighborhoods got trees grouped by those different market segments for yard tree giveaway programs in 3 cities. Notice that for programs in Baltimore and New York, the upscale avenues and high society areas are much higher than 1, indicating inequitable tree giveaways. But for Philly in purple, the value is much closer to 1 and hovers right around 1 for all the neighborhood types. And we suspect that this was due to those close partnerships with neighborhood groups and the mini grants that I mentioned earlier. Actually just froze. Ooh. Skipped ahead. There we go. But even with that kind of success, we know that equity and engagement could be improved. I think it's really crucial that we understand why residents and neighborhoods are less likely to participate. I worry sometimes that urban forestry advocates think that if we could just get everyone to hear how great trees are, then all residents would want them. But residents and community leaders' perspectives are more complicated than that. In order to effectively address barriers to participation, it's critical that we first understand what those barriers actually are. In the next few slides, I'm going to describe the first phase of this barriers to participation work. North Philly is considered a high priority area for planting by the PHS Tree Tenders program and in the Philly Tree Plan. The Tree Tenders program plants trees with community groups throughout the city, mostly street trees. Yet they've struggled to get Tree Tenders groups active in North Philly neighborhoods. Liz Riedman, who is here today, carried out 20 interviews with community leaders, 10 who were already active in Tree Tenders, although some more active than others, and 10 community leaders who seemed like prime candidates to get involved in the program, but have not done so. For context, I should tell you a little more about North Philly, which encompasses many neighborhoods north of the Center City Business District. In general, North Philly has relatively low canopy, it's lower income, high portions of Black and Latino residents. There's also substantial vacant land, and the housing stock is mostly row homes with little to no yard space. As an aside, PHS also works on vacant lot greening and urban gardening through other programs. So the community leaders were asked what factors helped facilitate tree planting. They reported widespread appreciation for trees and recognized the benefits of trees and green spaces. There were comments about cultural connections to trees and stories about one tree in a North Philly park that was painted with the Puerto Rican flag. Another interviewee brought up their childhood in the American South and wanted to bring closeness with nature to a northern city. Interviewees also talked about social benefits, bringing communities together and addressing violence. One leader said, quote, "We're doing everything we can to try to turn down the violence. And if tree planting brings more humanity to our community, then that is what you do," end quote. Another leader also spoke to the power of positive examples, explaining, quote, "After we planted the first set of trees, the neighbors who said they didn't want trees requested trees." And yet, despite a general desire for more green space and trees, community leaders described many barriers. By far, the most common barrier mentioned was the fear of future financial burden caused by tree disservices. What I mean by disservices are the problems caused by trees, such as property damage from trees that fall in storms or leaf litter that neighbors find irritating. One interviewee said, quote, "A few hundred or thousand to have a tree removed is unbearably high for our community. I kind of understand people are nervous about it. That can be several months of rent to get a big tree removed," end quote. Some leaders said that they also heard residents voice concern about liability from sidewalk tripping hazards or concerns that neighbors would argue over leaves blowing down a block. Many leaders were focused on the future of trees, feeling that residents did not have the ability or knowledge to care for trees into maturity. As one leader explained, quote, "If I'm a homeowner and someone tells me that I need a tree in front of my house, at first it's a beautiful idea. Then you have to think about it. What kind of tree is this going to be? What about when it falls over? Who is going to take care of it? What happens when the roots grow?" Related to these comments, community leaders reported the challenge of word of mouth stories about past tree damage. It seems like everybody knows somebody who had major problems with dangerous trees or costly removals. As critical context here, PPR has formal jurisdiction over street trees, but due to decades of underfunding, there's been a backlog of tree removal requests and generally insufficient levels of street tree maintenance. PPR staff are working really, really hard to improve the situation, but residents have long memories. As one tree tenders leader said, quote, "It's hard to argue with a resident in their 70s about trees not being destructive when they've lived in this neighborhood for 50 years and they can tell you about the damage they've seen." Going along with that last point, some interviewees mentioned a general mistrust of city organizations and skepticism over whether or not the engagement would be meaningful or long-lasting. Issues of trust were also mentioned in a similar study in Detroit, where researchers found that residents who declined free street trees sometimes did so because of a lack of trust in city agencies. Forces of development and gentrification were mentioned by some of the interviewees. Developers failed to partner with community leaders and would sometimes remove trees as part of the construction process and then do a poor job planting new ones. In particular, when vacant lots with planted trees and other vegetation got turned into buildings, residents and community leaders would get very upset. It's also important to note that many residents in these neighborhoods are renters who have little say in what kind of landscaping happens on or adjacent to their homes. On the gentrification topic, a recent study from Portland showed that recently planted trees are indeed associated with a modest increase in home prices. Yet sometimes worries around gentrification are about more than housing and rental prices. The dynamic between old and new residents can be very tricky to navigate, particularly if the tree planting leaders are from different racial or social classes than older residents. There are also basic logistical constraints. Since many homes in North Philly don't have much yard space, that means limited plantable space overall. These spacing limitations add pressure to trying to ensure that every available street tree space is used for a tree pit. Language barriers are a huge issue for the Latino community in North Philly, and as I mentioned earlier, PHS crafted their entire Tree Tenders Stewardship Training Series in Spanish, and that plus the dedication of a specific community leader has helped enormously with gaining inroads for tree planting in Latino neighborhoods. But even with that progress, several interviewees still said that more needs to be done with translating materials. And last but not least, the community leaders told us about their moral and ethical obligations to prioritize other community issues. Liz was doing these interviews during the first summer of the COVID pandemic, and so concerns over employment and food security were more severe than ever. Community leaders have to contend with other pressing problems like gun violence as well. These leaders are stretched thin and have a lot of responsibilities, and direct services like food pantries sometimes take priority over urban greening efforts. As one community leader put it very bluntly, quote, "Trees don't seem like the most urgent thing that my neighborhood needs." All right, now that I've gone over all those barriers, what can be done about it? Here are some initial, very preliminary ideas based on what we've heard from partners at PHS and PPR, as well as the insights from the community leaders that were interviewed. First, it's important to break down silos across different organizations that care for trees. Community leaders and residents want support over the whole lifespan of a tree. And so it's important to set up that support through all the different agencies that deal with the trees. Several ideas here also come down to money. Paid jobs for maintenance of young and old trees, grants for community organizing, and burden assistance for tree damage. Spending money on tree care and tree risk management can help pave the way for neighborhoods to accept young new tree plantings, as these actions would help to rebuild trust with the communities. Some other ideas include having jargon-free materials translated into relevant languages and bilingual staff. It might also be worth rethinking language around so-called tree myths. For instance, if a resident says that trees are damaging the sidewalks, hear them out, rather than countering that complaint with arguments over how sidewalks deteriorate over time regardless of tree presence. More importantly, listening to community needs and concerns seems paramount. Messaging around trees might also lean into other community priorities, such as focusing more on social benefits and fruit-bearing species. And building lasting partnerships is critical, and community leaders were nervous about initiatives that fade. But of course, actually realizing all these ideas is hard. PHS and PPR have been doing an amazing job, and their staff are truly dedicated to promoting equity and environmental justice, but we all know that there's a long way to go. Which brings me to the next phase of this project. What we learned in North Philly won't necessarily carry over to other neighborhoods in Philly or to towns in the suburbs. With funding from the Forest Service Urban and Community Forestry Program, we're going to repeat the North Philly study in West Philly, except this time expanding to speak to community leaders, tree recipients, and general pedestrians. And a big shout out to Beatra Wilson and Phil Rodbell for supporting this. So the neighborhoods in West Philly have more gentrification pressure due to nearby universities and also tend to have a little more yard space, which might impact the barriers. We're also going to do the same investigation in several towns in the Western Philly suburbs, which have different tree governance in terms of their township parks departments and how tree tenders groups function. And then the final phase of this project will be a couple of virtual workshops on the topic of barriers to participation. Who else is already investigating why people don't want trees in cities, whether university researchers or city agencies or nonprofits? What kinds of regional differences might there be across the US due to issues like climate or natural vegetation of the area or a city's development patterns? Perhaps several of us could collaborate to seek funding for an intercity study. And ultimately, it would be really great to identify the barriers, then jointly come up with clear solutions to those barriers and articulate those solutions to funders so that tree planting programs have the resources to do the important work of deepening engagement with underserved communities. And so that's it for my presentation. I'm putting up email addresses for myself and my colleague Hamil Pearsall. Please get in touch if you're interested in participating in that workshop I mentioned. And I invite Amber and Liz to unmute themselves for the Q&A. Hi, Amber. Hi, Liz.
Thanks, everybody. Liz, Amber, thanks for being here. Feel free to chime in with an additional comment or two, and we'll open the floor for questions. Great comments in the chat about differences in ownership.
And this is Jenny. I had a question about the survey or how you asked the questions. Was it specifically focused on just problems that they have, or did you ask a diversity of questions that didn't quite lead to like starting with a negative, like, why do you hate trees?
Well, Liz take that since she did the actual interviews.
Yeah, it was very open-ended. It was around an hour interview. Almost all of them were on Zoom because of COVID, but they were very open-ended, and they weren't even just about trees. I asked kind of to delve in about green spaces too in their neighborhood. So we talked about generally how they perceive trees or other green spaces in their neighborhood. And then we kind of went in more towards the barriers that they've encountered. And again, these interviews were with like people who were already active in tree planting initiatives, but also were with other community leaders who were not necessarily doing tree planting. So community gardens, religious leaders, other friends of park groups. So to reach people who weren't already active in those spaces.
Thank you.
Talk more later, or is interested in this virtual workshop and virtual meeting idea that I mentioned, if you or your partners are already doing something to understand what barriers are, we would love to hear from you. We'd love to connect. So just like pop your name in the chat if you don't feel like speaking up.
Lara, Liz and Amber, good stuff there. I really like the direction this is going. It's important too for us to understand. Do you see, I mean, right off the bat, it seems applicable nationwide to any major city in the US. Is there anything that is like not kind of nationally applicable? Do you see any regional differences that might come into play there?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at that. So the two first pieces of context about one, that it's a post-industrial city that lost population and the Parks Department was gutted. That's really critical. And that happened to a lot of other cities, but not every city. And so because the city lost a quarter of its population in the latter half of the 20th century, that set a lot of things in motion in terms of neglect of trees, not because the staff weren't qualified and dedicated, but because they just didn't have the resources. And so that's critical. The other critical piece is that we're in a forested biome. And so some of the complaints actually that we didn't hear as much, but were heard as part of the Philly tree plan, are about alleyway trees. So you have these like tight row houses and then alleyways and weedy trees grow up in them. So those kinds of dynamics won't play out in a place where trees don't grow so fast. Places that are more grassland or Mediterranean or other kinds of cities. I would think that there might be other kinds of worries about tree problems, say in the American West, where you have a lot of fires. If you're in a suburb or exurb where there's wildfires nearby, people might have other concerns. So yeah, that's part of why I think there'd be a great need to expand to other city comparisons, because not everything we heard in Philly is going to apply to every other neighborhood in every other city. I also even think that it's not just about the neighborhoods with Black and brown residents and that are low income. I mean, I think middle class white neighborhoods also can have people with concerns over trees. Because anytime you start talking about money that it costs to take care of trees, people like everything but the highest income levels might have qualms about that. So yeah, I think there's definitely a need to not completely extrapolate what we did. I do think it's applicable to probably like a quarter of the country.
Good. Well, that's
but even that
caveat.
I'm like cautious about.
I see it replicated in other areas of the U.S. One other thing that comes to mind, and that I've heard or had conversations with others about barriers, is that you go to these inner city kind of places, and there are no trees, and you're asking for kind of a participatory approach to planting and caring for these trees. And that's kind of been what we've tried to do traditionally, is if you get the participation, there's more investment, more likely to care, or the general thought process is they're likely to be cared for over the long term if people are invested in them. But you find any of that sentiment about, people in this neighborhood who could stand to benefit by some trees saying, well, why are you asking us to plant and care for these trees? Do those people over there in the high society places, did they have to plant and care for their trees? Or was that done for them?
Do you want to tackle that one, Amber? I feel like you probably have some insights if you're willing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that there's a variety of different perspectives, I think, in Philadelphia surrounding that. So I've heard folks share things like, you know what, for example, care who plants the trees. I think our neighborhood needs more trees, but you know, there's a reason why we don't have trees. It's not necessarily our doing, and so white folks should come into our neighborhood and plant them and do the labor. So I've heard perspectives like that. I've heard the opposite as well, of folks saying, you know what, it's my community, like I want to do this work, and it should be done by us and for us. So I think, you know, everyone is going to have a different perspective on what should happen. And that's kind of the theme of today, is like listening to individual communities is going to be like result in the best solution.
Yeah,
I don't know if you want to build on that, Liz.
I appreciate that, Amber. I'd be curious to hear from others in the planning space and urban forest management space who have thoughts about who's really ultimately responsible for it. If the neighborhood can't rise up and say, yeah, we can get the right people out there, to be managers and leaders, to take that on ourselves and just get the trees in the ground.
It varies within cities and across cities too. So a lot of the comments I was giving applied to street trees, but not all of them. And I think that even just like who manages the right of way and the street tree corridors varies city to city. Not all cities have as much vacant land as ours does. And I don't think it's reasonable to expect the average resident or even the average community leader to know what all the different like agencies' purviews are, which is part of why I think it's so critical for all those who manage trees on a variety of public, semi-public, and private lands to better coordinate, because there's clearly giant gaps where this organization does this other organization does that, the utility does this, and a resident might feel bothered by one of those actions, but then apply it to the whole mix of the agencies that are involved. And again, residents have a lot of things going on in their lives. Why should they know about the intricacies of tree governance? I think it's on us to better communicate and better coordinate the care of trees, cradle to grave.
Yeah, and ultimately, you know,
I'm gonna jump in, Scott. I want to make sure other folks get a chance to ask questions. So I'm gonna jump in on you there. Thank you, sir.
If we're over time too, Janice, just like stop us, and you know, people
I
can
think we
rate me
probably
if they
have
want
time
to
for one other question from anybody else. I just wanted to share the airspace. Yep, there's a flag around. All speakers in today's collaboration are white, and naming it. Thank you, Isa, for flagging it. Absolutely. It is a shift that needs to happen in this field. Lisa, do you want to speak to it, or just chime in the chat?
Hey, that was a private message.
I apologize. I totally apologize. Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about inequity and stuff, and I think that it's really difficult to stand back and not lead. And I wish there was more diversity. I wish there was more diversity speaking, and it's not personal, you guys. I don't, the talks have been awesome, and I don't mean to be an ass, but at the same time, I'm in a leadership institute. The cadre's white. It costed me thousands of dollars of my own personal money. And when you look at the screens, it's the same darn thing. And we're talking about inclusion, equity, and diversity. And I'm not sure how we got here, but my heart is broke. My heart is truly broke that we're in this place that we just can't seem to get over. And I'm also going to call this out too. You know, we're getting all this money from polluters. Shit, they're the ones that are causing the problem. And we become co-opted because we can't speak against these large polluters because they're funding us. And then my Forest Service money that's coming through the state, I can't plant on private property. But yet, that's where urban heat island, that's where the food deserts are. And to me, the reason that there's such a big jam about trees right now is because people are afraid of climate change. People see it's getting hotter, people are dying. I mean, this is real stuff. And people are freaking hungry in my town. We have so many more people on the streets. And we're not better than them. We're not better than their worst day or where they're at in their life. And it feels like that sometimes in urban forestry. And I don't mean to be rude, but I just want to name it because she made me. So sorry, and thanks for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Lisa. There is no need at all to be sorry. So thank you, honestly, from the bottom of my heart for saying that. It's critical. It's critical to voice these concerns. And I, as one of the many white people in the room, I worry there's too much like talking down to neighborhoods of color or to low-income neighborhoods of, you need this, we're gonna solve this problem. Not enough listening and not enough like hiring people who have actually relevant skills that could be doing this work and aren't. I mean, I know Amber and Liz think about this all the time too.
I was at, we were in one of our teams, and I was totally heartbroken that the word token came up. And the person actually was talking about qualifications, like he had already given the qualifications to a Caucasian person. Well, how am I supposed to hire this token? What? And I'm like, wow, we're not even talking qualifications, we're talking bias. And who we've hired in the government, both at the federal level and the state level, there's not a lot of equity there. So for them coming to us in the field, asking us to find that where all of our leaders are mostly all the same color is really disheartening. And it's very difficult for us in the streets to make that change.
Never say sorry for voicing those observations. That keep them coming. That's literally what makes change, and it needs to be called out. Like, these spaces are overwhelmingly white, and it's super problematic, and they shouldn't be. I mean, there are Black and brown folks who are working in this field, who are often, even if they play a role as in my opinion, important stakeholders via their own community organizations or just as individual residents, are often shut out of the process, right? And I've recognized that in my own work. And so keep calling it out and never apologize for it.
But I just wanted to chime in too with, all the mapping and everything that we can do aerially and from like that 30,000 foot level, we can see problems and we can diagnose problems spatially, like, and using the census data and grouping things at that high level. But that's what I like about the projects that, like, no, we are on the ground. We are talking to people, like, here's Lauren, like we are asking them. And I refer to the lots in Baltimore and the work that Lauren Marshall is doing. It's like, what do people want? We have to ask them. We can't tell them. And it can be drastically different than you start out thinking. So that's where I'm just like coming down from like that spatial analysis level of like, oh, we see, this distribution of resources that's inequitable. That's, the diagnosis, but the solutions that's what we're talking about. We have to get into who are the people at the table that matter.
Any other comments?
Well, this has clearly raised a lot of passionate ideas. Please, again, feel free to, if you want to follow up with us on this specific thing about why people don't want to plant trees, to learn more, to listen more, to more communities, more neighborhoods, and to then devise strategies to actually deal with it.
And to end, like, yeah, too, Lara, like, whiteness is a barrier, right? Whiteness is a barrier to getting trees in the ground. So a really good observation for Lisa to highlight and for everyone to go away and think about.
Yeah, and Amber ran a wonderful session at a conference, a geography conference last week, where we had more diverse voices on the panel. And one woman in particular called out, there's this unfortunate tendency to say socioeconomic when we really mean race. And it's important to say race because it matters to the conversation. It matters to the barriers conversation. It matters to the employment conversation. So I'm guilty of also saying socioeconomic is a catch-all, but it's not the catch-all.
Any other comments or reflections? Thank y'all.
Janice, Mike Gavin has his hand up.
Oh, Mike Galvin, how polite of you. Mike Galvin, hop on in. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, the landscape that you see in front of you is sometimes it's helpful to know those things. I know one of the things in Baltimore, where I worked for a long time, is in the turn of the last century, there were groups called community improvement associations. And even though that sounds like a really good thing, one of the activities they did was plant trees. Another one they did was enforce covenants to make sure that no people of color lived in that neighborhood. So those things are conflated to people. If you have grandparents or something in that neighborhood that are old enough to remember that, and you say, hey, we're going to come in and plant trees for you, we're going to make it better. That has a real different meaning that you wouldn't even understand walking into it. So some of those things are super helpful to look back and understand.
Thank you. Some additional awesome comments in the chat. Thanks,
Pushing
everyone.
you way over time, Janice. Messing up your
Totally,
agenda.
some things are worth going over time. Some things are worth going over time. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for being brave, for being open, for expand their thinking.
Hey, Janice.
Absolutely. So, yes, ma'am.
Janice, it's Rachel. I apologize, but I'm just looking at body language in the room, and I know that we have an agenda and we're trying to keep the time, but maybe I just want to make sure that there's folks that have said what they need to say.
Absolutely.
And if
If
not,
anyone else?
now's the time. We can take, this is a really important conversation, and I know we have some closing remarks, but or a Capitol Hill briefing, but has everyone had the chance to say what they feel they need to say?
Rachel,
And John, I love you, but I am going to ask if we can prioritize other voices in the room right now, if you don't mind.
I just want to say that when we're out there, the technical exchange creates a power shift. And so it feels like we're just teaching how to plant trees, but there's a power shift happening when we go there and get in charge, even on the smallest things. And so I just want to name that, you know, I've got board members there, I didn't like master gardeners, and that's just what they do is teach. But there's a power play that happens when you go there and tell people what to do and show them, you know. And so it's planting a tree. Seriously, it's planting a tree. If it's not too low, we're cool. And I think sometimes we get caught up in our certifications that we just can't give up the power sometimes. And that's probably the greatest lesson I've learned lately is it doesn't really matter if it's, I mean, as long as it's not buried and it's in a good spot, like you could just step back and be quiet and celebrate, because that's really what they need. They need us to be allies, and they don't need us to show them anything. We just planted at a mosque, and this gal was just going on and on. Guess what? The gal that lived there has a horticulture degree, and she found herself in a back seat in her own backyard for no reason. So we just don't know. We make all these assumptions that people don't know stuff when we get there, and they do know. We just don't give them credit because we see them as, anyways, you know what I mean. It's just going to take some time to make the change. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Anybody else want to chime in? We are gonna, and I'm gonna let you here go to a break before Capitol Hill, but Rachel, good call. Important to give space. Anybody else want to jump in, particularly if you haven't spoken in a large group since intros?
Janice, can I jump in really quickly? First of all, Lisa,
Yes.
thanks for bringing pause to what is our normal follow the agenda process. But I just have, I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm listening, and I'm thinking to myself, like, so much of our agency is going through just federal government Forest Service, for those of you who don't know me. But urban and community forestry is a Justice 40 covered program under this administration, which means that the expectation is that we're going to be working towards no less than 40% of the benefits of our program flowing to the most vulnerable. And there's a whole lot of talk about how to engage with the most vulnerable and who can engage with the most vulnerable and or disadvantaged, whatever way you want to describe the communities. We know exactly the maps have not changed much over time. They've only gotten worse if you grew up in one of those blocks that are on the red as part of the map. This is why I feel like right now, urban and community forestry has a huge opportunity to lead. And it is the vulnerability that people like Lisa will put herself out there, even though it was a private message. It was a public thought for people who have been in the backseat in their own neighborhood. So don't worry about that. I do think that it is, I just want to say that it felt good to know that I sit in meetings all day where people are still worrying about using the right word or what's the definition of underserved when I give a presentation. And the fact that we can be beyond that, right? There's so much work to do. And in terms of grabbing a partner, grabbing people who are trusted in the communities, I will challenge you all, go back to the presentation from the Tree Philly plan. There were some really nice jewels in there and very plain language. It's definitely a different way of doing business. It's a slower way of doing business, but I will guarantee you it's a more sustainable and the impact will be tremendous. If you're talking about, if you're in this work for the next generation of conservation, then it will be more rewarding and continuing to just do what we've always done. So thank you again, and I'll yield back, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Petra. Last call just for this moment in this conversation, not for this conversation in SUFC. Some great additions coming in the chat. I hope that this conversation will continue, maybe even into the evening reception and beyond, obviously well beyond, but in terms of today. So thank you again for candor, willingness to stretch, willingness to be challenged, and willingness to challenge.